Vocabulary. Today's seminar is on the living will, how to write and maintain a proper Islamic will. I'll just go over the description first and then the introduction of our speakers today. The Prophet ﷺ told us not to delay having a will if one has any wealth. This is part of being prepared for the reality of death and fulfilling the rights of one's inheriting family. In this seminar, Sheikh Faraz Rabbani will cover the importance of having a living will, how to make one's will Islamically sound and legally sound, and how to ensure that one keeps the will up to date and with one's religious and worldly debts and dues. So a little bit about our teachers today. Sheikh Faraz Rabbani spent 10 years studying with some of the leading scholars of recent times, first in Damascus and then in Amman, Jordan. His teachers include the foremost theologian of recent times in Damascus, the late Sheikh Adib al-Sallas, may Allah have mercy on him, as well as his student, Sheikh Hassan al-Hindi, one of the leading Hanafi fuqaha of the present age. He returned to Canada in 2007, where he founded Seekers Hub in order to meet the urgent need of spreading Islamic knowledge, both online and on the ground, in a reliable, relevant, inspiring, and accessible manner. He is the author of Absolute Essentials of Islam, Faith, Prayer, and the Path of Salvation, according to the Hanafi school. Since 2011, Sheikh Faraz has been named one of the 500 most influential Muslims by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center. And now a little bit about Sheikh Yusuf Weltch, who will be running the first session of today's seminar. He was born and brought up in New Jersey. He accepted Islam by the grace of Allah at the hands of his older brother in 2008. Soon thereafter, he was afforded the opportunity to study at Darul Uloom in New York for an intensive 4 years where he studied the Arabic language as well as the Urdu language. In addition, he also studied Creed, Logic, Hanafi Fiqh, Tafsir, and Hadith. After completing 4 years, he traveled to Tarim, Hadramaut, where he studied in the world-renowned Madrasa Darul Mustafa under some of the great scholars and ascetics of Tarim, many of whom are direct descendants of the noble messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. During his time in Tarim, Sheikh Yusuf completed the memorization of Quran, memorized the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi, and also studied a number of subjects such as inheritance, usul al-tafsir, usul al-hadith, tafsir of the Quran, Islamic history, and a number of texts on spirituality. So Sheikh Yusuf will go over the first session, which will run until 2:30 or 2:40, and then it will be followed up by Sheikh Faraz's session. So over to Sheikh Yusuf now.
المرسلين وآله وصحبه التابعين وقد نوينا تعلم تعليم ذكر التذكير نفع الانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى وكتابة الخير وصلة الرحام قدمنا الله مشايخنا وابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Before we start, some of our teachers, they taught us that if you're ever praised with that which you don't really have in you, then just say Ameen and consider it a dua. So, one beautiful faida from their humility. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We wanted to talk about the importance of the will before you guys take the specifics and the nuanced details of how to make the will, but just to increase the importance of what's to come in our hearts, because a person is according to what their concern is. Right? The person's heart is attracted to that which it gives most importance to. So if the more importance we have, for instance, for our prayer, the more focus we will have therein, the more importance we have for the Quran, the stronger our relationship will be with the Quran. So just to increase our understanding of how important and how much emphasis has been put on the idea of having the wasiyyah, the living will, from the Quran and from the Hadith. So this will be my role, but the actual specifics you'll do with Sheikh Faraz, inshallah. So Allah Allah says in Surah Al-Mulk, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. That He is the one who created death and life to test you, which of you is the most beautiful in deeds. Right? Ahsan comes from the word beauty, from hasan. Right? So which of you is the best in good deeds? It is interesting to note that Allah starts with death. He didn't say He created life and death, which is how we normally say it. He said He created death and life. Right? Because the test is now. We're in the test. When we hand it in is when we die. Right? That's like when you're in school, the teacher gives out the test, and once the time is up, you have to hand it in. Pencils down, they say. Right? So our test, the result of our test will be seen after death, not necessarily in this life. So the preparation for death, right, and is how we live our life, what we do, the choices that we make. And one of the most beautiful things about a person in regards to their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Allah has given us instructions for every aspect of our life. There is not, and this is why there's such an importance of seeking knowledge, right? Because the worst situation that a believer could find themselves in is to not know what Allah wants from them at that specific instance. Right? So for a person whose life is dedicated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, into the submission of Allah, dedicated to the worship of Allah and to the service of the creation for the sake of Allah, to not know what Allah wants from them is devastating. It's a calamity. And so the Prophet he said that seeking knowledge is obligatory. Right? Why? Because without it, it's the roadmap. Without it, a person will not be able to succeed in their purpose, in their mission. So Allah says in the Quran, وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ, that we revealed to you, meaning speaking to the Prophet ﷺ, we revealed to you the book, meaning the Quran, as a clarifying factor for everything. That it gives clarity to everything. That any aspect that you find yourself in your life, the answer of what to do in that situation is in the Quran, and realized in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And all of it is leading up, all of this is instructions leading up to the end of the test, which is death. And so all of it is preparation for death before it comes, and even to the extent that we have divine as well as prophetic teachings about what to do when death comes. Right? So even to the extent that one, for instance, a family member is at the moment of death, that they're about to pass away. Many instances, they would call and they would ask, what do we do? We don't know what to do. And that is a terrible situation to find oneself in, but the instructions are there. The teachings are there. The Prophet ﷺ taught us how to say the kalima la ilaha illallah to the person who's about to pass away in such a way that is gentle, just enticing them to say it back to you without forcing them, without telling them, say this, right? Because that has implications, it could be detrimental. So I just say, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, until they repeat it. Once they repeat it, silence. Because our goal is to make that the last thing that they say. Right? And the Prophet said that whoever's last words in this world are La ilaha illallah, they'll enter Jannah. Right? So we're trying to get them to say that last. So if they say La ilaha illallah, we're silent. If they start to talk, can you give me some water? We repeat La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, because now the last thing that they said has changed. We want to repeat. But we don't say La ilaha illallah, say La ilaha illallah right now. No, I don't want to say it. That's not the way you want to end your life. Right? Also, the Prophet ﷺ taught us to read Surah Yasin at the time, in the presence of that person. Also, if they can, if it's possible, to turn them to the Qibla, to face the Qibla. So we have very clear instructions about to do, even when death is at its point, about to come. As far as after death has come, right, we also have instructions. Right? What to do with the body, how to treat the body, right? To treat the body with respect, And a lot of the scholars, they mentioned that if a person, the way that a person treats the deceased is the way that Allah will subjugate for them when they die, somebody to treat them. Right? So to have so much respect for the body of, especially for the believer, to respect them, to not toss them around, or even to the extent that scholars mentioned that the temperature of the water that is used to wash the body is very important. Because if it's really hot water, that the body still has a link to the soul, so they can feel the pain. So they mentioned that you should treat the body the way that you would treat them in life, right? Freezing cold water. This is bad etiquettes with the deceased. And then also the prayer itself, right? We can easily Allahu Akbar, but to read it and actually make the dua, right? To make the dua, to ask Allah to forgive them, ask Allah to have mercy on them. Allah will subjugate for us, when we pass away, someone to treat us with the same respect. So we have very clear instructions from birth all the way till past death, in Islam. How to deal with a newborn, right? How to deal with an adult, how to deal with a child, how to deal with an elder, how to deal with a relative. We have clear instructions for every aspect of our life. So the Quran is the clarifier for everything. So one of the ways, one of the important aspects of preparing for that death, right, which the word that Allah uses for death in the Quran is very interesting. He says, "Hatta ya'tiyaka al-yaqeen," until certainty comes to you, meaning death. Right? Because what is there that's more certain than death? Even if somebody is not religious, right, then they still wouldn't deny the fact of death. Right? So Allah calls it certainty. So one of the biggest ways to prepare for that certainty is preparing this will. Right? To leaving instructions behind. And Allah mentions in the Quran that it is prescribed, this is in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 180, prescribed for you when death approaches any one of you, if he has any wealth left behind, is that he should make a bequest, meaning a will for his parents, his relatives, according to what is acceptable. Right? A duty upon the righteous. This is a duty, it's an obligation. And the word kutiba, right, means it's been prescribed, it means it's been made obligatory. It's the same word that we use for Ramadan. Right? Kutiba alaykum as-siyam, kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum. It has been prescribed to you to fast, just like it has been prescribed to those before you. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, ما حق امرئ مسلم له شيء يوصي فيه يبيت ليلتين إلا ووصيته مكتوبة عنده. He says, this is narrated by Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, that it is the duty of a Muslim who has anything to bequeath, he has wealth left behind, that he should not let 2 nights pass without having his will written and present with him. He should have that will with him. And this is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. So the Prophet ﷺ instructed us that 2 nights, two nights should not even pass if a person has wealth that he's leaving behind. That 2 nights should not pass, except that that will is with them, or at least accessible, and the people who would take care of his affairs after he passed away know where it is and how to access it. Right? If it's saved on the computer or if it's written, right? The scholars of the past, they would have it under their pillow every night. They would have something written, instructions, as a will, and they would sleep with it. They would put it under their pillow. And it is mentioned about Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, that he had left under his pillow when he passed away. Under his pillow was his wasiyah. After hearing, and the narrator of this hadith is Ibn Umar, he himself, he said that not a single night has passed since he heard that hadith, since he heard the Prophet say that, except that he had always had his will with him. So, but because of neglect, right, because of sometimes maybe not knowing, one could possibly think just before they die, they could, seeking to get one last good deed, they might actually end up earning one grave sin as their last action, which is mentioned in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ. A man came to the Prophet and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, tell me about my wealth. How do I give in charity from it?" the Prophet ﷺ said, by Allah, I will tell you, you should give charity when you're healthy, when you're covetous for more, you're strong enough to earn more, you want to save more and more, right? You hope to become wealthy, and you fear becoming poor. Right? These are the best time to give sadaqah, right? And the Prophet said in another place, "Afdal sadaqah al dhahri ghina." The best charity is that which when you're just about to be affluent. Right? You have just all you need to do is save a little bit more. Charity at that time, hardest on the ego and most beloved to Allah. Right? So he says that you should give charity when you are healthy, covetous of gaining more, hoping for affluence and fearful of poverty. And do not be negligent until your soul reaches here. And he pointed at his throat, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Then you say, okay, just at the point of about to die, he's like, okay, then give half of this money goes to this person, half of this money goes to this person. When actually, at that time, it's not allowed. Because what happens is you are disinheriting your heirs. Because of inheritance laws, whatever you leave behind, they have a right to it. So if just before you die, half of my wealth goes to this person, half of my wealth, what's left for the children, what's left for the parents, what's left for the grandparents. So he says, do not be negligent until the soul reaches here, meaning the throat. Then you say, my wealth is for so-and-so, my wealth is for so-and-so, whilst it is rightfully for others, even if you dislike it. So thinking that he's getting, okay, I'm about to die, what's a good deed to do? Charity. Let me give all my wealth in charity, right? And leave nothing for my family. Right? So the knowledge of these things is very important because we don't want to fall into something unknowingly at the last portion of our life. And the Prophet said that actions are based on their endings. Right? We know the famous hadith that actions are based on their intentions. But there's another hadith, actions are based on their endings. So the way a person ends their life might change the whole way that they come on the day of judgment. Right? We know the story about the person who killed 99 people. Right? He killed 99 people. He goes to one man and he asks, will Allah ever forgive me? And the guy, no, Allah won't forgive you. 99 people? No way Allah's forgiving you. So he killed him also, 100 people. Right? So then he went to another person who had knowledge, a person of knowledge, and he said, will Allah forgive you? And the guy said, yes, Allah will forgive you. But you should leave the place that you are because it's a bad environment for you. It's an evil place. And go to the place of righteous people. Right? So, and then the man, he died before he even reached there. But as the hadith mentions, that Allah made the angels measure the distance between the place that he was heading to, the place of the righteous people, and the place that he came from, which is the place of the evil people. And whichever one he's closer to, then the angels of either mercy or punishment will take him. So, because of his last effort of rectifying his relationship with Allah, Allah let the angels of mercy take him. And the story is a very long story, but the way a person ends their life is extremely important. So, which leads us to another thing. So we have one thing is the wasiyah, the will. The other is the inheritance, right? And Allah has stipulated in the Quran very specific rules for inheritance, right? And there's a handful of verses that go into very great detail. يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنثَيَيْنِ إِنْ كُنَّ نِسَاءً فَوْقَ اثْنَتَيْنِ فَلَهُنَّ الثُّلُثُ مِمَّا تَرَكَ. If there's more than two girls and they each get a third of what is left behind, right? Then talking about the spouses, if the spouse doesn't have a child, then they get a fourth. If they do, then they get eighth. If you pass away and you don't have a child, then the wife gets a half, right? And if you do, very specific rulings, and for a reason too. So part of our test in this life is submission. Right? To submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not just by limbs. Right? We know about the submission of limbs, right? To pray salat, right? To do the hajj, if a person is able. Right? These are outward submission, but there's an inward submission also, which is a submission of the intellect. Right? That Allah, to know that Allah is all wise. Allah knows everything about everything. And that what Allah decides for us is better than what we can decide for ourselves. Like maybe I think, like, okay, why would I let them inherit? They're not really a good relative to me, and I'll just give it to somebody else instead. But Allah knows, as Allah says in the Quran, وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, that Allah knows And we don't know. And at the end of one of these long passages about specific inheritance laws, Allah says, يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ أَن تَضِلُّوا. Allah is clarifying this to you. Again, what we mentioned before about clarifying. Allah is clarifying this to you, lest you go astray, so that you don't go astray. وَاللَّهُ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. And Allah has knowledge over everything. Right? Why did He mention knowledge at that point? Right? Because a person might think, like, no, this person's more deserving of my money. This person, whereas Allah has already dictated that. And then at the end of another set of passages regarding inheritance, right? Allah says, those are the limits set by Allah. That's how it is. That's how Allah wants it. Those are the limits set by Allah, and whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger will be admitted into His garden, by Him to gardens of paradise, under which rivers flow, abiding eternally therein. Right? And that is the greatest success. That is the greatest success. So, the ideal of submission is there. That's the rules of Allah, and whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger, right? Meaning they set aside what they think is best. They set aside what the desires, right, the ego dictates, and they say, no, Allah and His Messenger want this, and that's what's best for me. Right? And then He says, and whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger and transgresses His limits, meaning the limits that we mentioned being set by Allah, He will put him in the fire. May Allah save us from that. May Allah save us from the fire. So this idea of submission to Allah is in every aspect of our life. Every single aspect of our life. Which in essence is the definition of Islam. Right? Allah has given us choice. Right? We have the freedom to choose what we want to do. Choose, right, which path to take. When there's a fork in the road, we have the choice to take. Right? But true submission is to say, I don't want to choose from in and of myself. I want to choose what you want. Right? I want to do what Allah wants from me instead. Right? And in that is true honor. And in that is true serenity. And in that is true tranquility and true peace. And the best of this world and the best of the next world. Right? Blessings amongst the family, united hearts in the household. Right? All of that is under that umbrella of submission. So one of the purposes of this submission in regards to inheritance and both the living will is to avoid disputes in the family. How many families have been broken up? Right? Cousins who used to like each other, brothers and sisters who used to be very close, but a parent or a relative dies, and because of the money that was left behind, and because of a lack of instruction of what to do with that money, they start to fight. Why do you get this share? Right? I should get more than you. I took care of them more than you did. Right? All of this dispute starting because of money. Right? And human beings, as Allah says, in the Insana لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ, that the human beings are severely in love with money. Right? And money in and of itself is not bad or good. Right? It's just a thing. Right? But and even the word that Allah uses in that verse for money is khayr, which is good. It means good. Right? All right. So it's not the money's fault. It's the person's desire for more, or the person, maybe they need it, but because of a lack of instruction and a lack of understanding of the rulings, then this causes dispute amongst the family. Whereas the word for family in Arabic, or the word that is used for family ties, is rahim. It actually means the womb, right? The womb of the mother. And so siratul rahim, which is to join family ties, is literally to join the womb, like those who came from the same womb as you, right? But the word rahim in Arabic has a 3-letter root, ra, ha, mim, the same root as rahman and rahma, mercy, right? And the scholars, they mentioned that the woman, right, which in Old English is the man with the womb man, that the woman is the source of mercy into the world. The manifestation of Allah's mercy is through the woman, right? The mercy, one of the greatest ideals of mercy that we know is the mercy that a mother has for their child, right? And one time, one of the sahabiyats, the female sahaba, she lost her child, and she was searching around everywhere for the child. And then finally, after a long search, she grabbed him, picked him up, hugged him, and the Prophet ﷺ from a distance is speaking to his companions and said, "Do you see that woman over there?" Right? And then they said, "Yeah, we see her." And the Prophet said, "Do you think that she would ever throw her child into the hellfire, into fire?" They said, "Wallahi, no. I swear by Allah, she would never do that, right? Because that's not the nature of a loving mother, right?" So the Prophet said to them, "Allahu arhamu bi'ibadihi min hadihi biwalidiha." That Allah has more mercy for His servants than this woman has for her child, right? So the Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, right? That same word goes back to the womb. So that the concept of the family in Islam is extremely important, right? So if us being negligent about the will and the inheritance laws, I mean, a lot of people, they try to put it off as if death is not going to come, because to think about death can be very, for the person who has strong attachment to this world, can be very disconcerting. It could be very depressing. And a lot of people, they don't like to speak about death, and then they'll say that you're being morbid or that you're being depressing, right? But the Prophet said to remember death often. Right? And for the person who has love for Allah and love for His Messenger, death is the only barrier between being united with the beloved. Right? So they don't see death as something as bad. And this is well shown in the story of Sayyidina Bilal ibn Abi Rabah, the great mu'addin of the Prophet ﷺ, that when he died, his wife, at the time that he was about to pass away, she said, what a calamity, right? What a travesty that my husband's about to die, that you're about to die. She's saying that it's for calamity for you, and you're about to die. He said, no. He said, wa taraba, what the greatest day of my life, he said. Tomorrow I will meet Muhammad and his companions. I mean, the people who he loved so much. He will be able to meet them. So death in itself doesn't have to be bad. We have a merciful Lord on the other side of this death, right? But we don't want to make that our lack of preparation for death the cause of being distanced from the merciful Lord, of earning the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if I don't leave any instructions and I'm the cause of my family being disunited after me, then how am I going to meet Allah and answer for that? We have a hadith from Amr bin Sa'ad. He narrates from his father that he said that the father is saying, he's narrating himself, he said, I became sick at the year when Mecca was conquered. The Prophet he gained victory over Mecca, and he entered in with his head so low that his beard was touching the top of his animal. Right, out of complete humility, right? He conquered them. And he said, what should I do with you now? And people who exiled him, killed his uncle, and they said, you should treat us well. I mean, you're a noble person, the son of a noble person. And he said that I'll say to you what Yusuf said to his brothers, that there's no reproach on you today, you are free to go. May Allah forgive you. Right? So on that year, this man, he said, I was sick that year. I fell sick, and I knew that I was going to die. So the Messenger of Allah, ﷺ, which is the Sunnah, he visited me. To visit the sick is the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Messenger of Allah ﷺ visited me. So I said, O Messenger of Allah, I have a lot of wealth, I have much wealth, and I have no one to inherit me except for one daughter. Should I give 2/3 of my wealth in charity? 2/3 out of all of his wealth? It's a lot of money. So the Prophet said, no. So I said, how about 1/2? He said, no. So I said, how about 1/3? He said, 1/3, okay, and 1/3 is plenty. Give 1/3 of your wealth as charity. For indeed, for you to leave one of your heirs rich, he's giving so much money, for you to leave them rich is better for you to leave them poor, having to beg the people. To make 2/3 of that wealth is going to go to one daughter. It's a lot of money. And she turned out to become very rich when her father passes away. right? But that is better than giving the charity to everybody else and leaving her poor, and leaving her with nobody to support her, nobody to help her, right? So the family has preference, right? So 1/3 of the wealth after debts are cleared, right, can be given to whoever you instruct people to give to. Right? You can write there, I want it to be given to the masjid, I want it to be given to this person. Right? But the other 2/3 is written by Allah. Allah has already determined that a portion goes to this person, a portion according to the inheritance law, which you do with Sheikh Faraz. Right? So that's one of the biggest things, family. Right? Family have that preference. So, regarding this living will, there's a few things that have to be, and we'll go into details with Sheikh Faraz. That one is clearing up debts. Right? Debt in Islam, it's permissible to take debts, but it's something that a person should go into knowing the gravity of the situation, knowing how important the responsibility is for debts. Right? Because this is something that we should be very concerned about. So if we're going to enter into some sort of contract, either personally or that puts us into debt, we should think very deeply. Am I able to pay this on time? Am I able to fulfill this? And am I going to have all of my debts in a register and written properly so that if I do die, prior to fulfilling it, that there's instructions and clear enough instructions that this is how much I owe to this person, this is how much I owe to this person, this is how much I owe to this person, very clearly. Or is it just something I keep in my head? I know I owe that, right? But when I die, nobody's going to know that, right? And this is something grave because the Prophet ﷺ, he said that Allah will forgive for the martyr, the person who dies for the sake of Allah, right? The martyr, every sin except for debt. Right? Even the martyr, the one, as the hadith mentioned, that even before his blood hits the ground, he's forgiven, right? But Allah, the Prophet ﷺ gave except one thing. One thing is debt. Another time, the Prophet ﷺ, he was about to lead the prayer of one of the companions that passed away. He approached the body and then he stepped back. He said, "You guys pray you pray for him. You do the prayer of janazah for him." And they asked why. He said, "Because he has debts." Right? And the ones out of nowhere, he said, "I'll take all of his debts." He said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yes." "Will you pay every single thing? All of it? Every penny?" "Yes." And then the Prophet said, "Okay, let's start the prayer." This is something of grave importance. And the Prophet ﷺ, he used to make this dua, and this is a dua that we should prophetically, we're taught to read morning and evening. It's, "Oh Allah, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan." "Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from grief and anxiety. Wa min al-ajzi wal-kasal," and from incapacity or helplessness and laziness. Wa min al-jubn wal-bukhl, and from cowardice and from stinginess, miserliness. Wa min ghalabat ad-dayn, and to be overpowered by debt, overcome with debt. To seek refuge from that. وَقَهْرِ الرِّجَالِ, the last one, and to be under the forceful power of other people. Even in regards to zakat, one of the types of people who you can give zakat to is the person who's in debt. The person has so much debt that it encompasses the rest of their wealth. That they might have $1,000, but they have $10,000 in debt. Right? So there you can give zakat to them to help them, free them from that debt. And so there was a lot of importance was given to that. So because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Badilu bil a'mal," hasten toward good deeds. Are you waiting for old age, which will make one senile? Right? Are you waiting for sudden death? Right? Are you waiting for that to happen so you can't do any more good deeds? Right? So to prepare for death, one of it is to not procrastinate in regards to good deeds. Opportunity to do good deeds, do it. Right? Because death is not written. Right? the child can die before the father. There's an order of which we come into this world, but it's not necessary that we all leave in that same order. Right? That I came in first before my relatives, so I must go first. There's no such thing. And how many times people who are sick, and one of the great scholars of Pakistan, one of the great pious people of Pakistan, Haj Abdul Wahab, he said that 6 doctors told me I was going to die, and they gave me a specific time period. Right? I prayed the janazah for all 6 of them. That's the way it works. Right? Whenever Allah sets a time for somebody, then there's no. If Allah wants to delay, how many sick people have lived very much longer than they were supposed to, and how many healthy people died in an instant. So that's in regards to worldly debts, right? Financial debts amongst people, but there are other types of debts, right? So, for instance, the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over us. So the zakat. Maybe there's missed zakat. A few years I didn't get to pay. I didn't pay my zakat for a few couple of years. So that accumulates, and that's something that a person has to pay. But in regards to the giving of debts, that the debts of the people are cleared first, and then the debts of zakat. Also, fasting. The person is not able to fast, right? Or they miss certain fasts, and they pass away, right? They should have a list. How many fasts did I miss that I didn't get to make up, right? Maybe there's a certain period of life where things were tough, Iman was low, I didn't get to fast, right? So I should keep a number. I should take account how long was that, how many days, right? And then so that the person after me can give fidya, expiation for those days. So on the Day of Judgment, when I'm asked about my fasting, right, that it's taken care of. Also Hajj. You can instruct in your will that somebody does Hajj on your behalf. Especially if you're leaving the money behind for that purpose. That's an important thing. Also, if a person made an oath, right, to do something that they swore by Allah that they're going to do this, and they weren't able to do it in time. Right? So they can put that I did this, I swore this oath. Also, trusts. Right? If somebody gave you something as a trust, to hold it for them for a while, or you're keeping something safe for other people, right? And you pass away, and nobody knows about it. One, that person's never going to get their thing back, right? And plus, it's something that a person will have to answer to on the Day of Judgment. Allah says in the Quran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ أَن تُؤَدُّ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا. Allah has commanded you to return the trusts back to their people. And this is something that the Prophet ﷺ was very specific on. When he left for Hijrah, even though the Quraysh, meaning Abu Jahl and all of these people were enemies to the Prophet ﷺ, but they still had their stuff with him as a trust. Right? Because they knew that no matter how bad we are to him, he will never oppress us and take our stuff. You know, if we possess something of somebody else, and that person tried to kill us or tried to exile us, we probably, no, I'm not giving it back. At the least, I'm going to keep it. But the Prophet, he left Ali behind for Hijrah. He made the Hijrah to Medina. He left Ali behind to distribute to every person all of their belongings. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So, in coming to a close, the Prophet he taught us that there are many things in regards to our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are extremely important. One of the bases of our purpose in life is ubudiyyah, right? Servanthood, slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that part of that slavehood is submission, as we mentioned already, submission of the limbs, submission of the heart, submission of the intellect, right? To what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. So everything that we own in this life, that we somewhat possess, and you can use the quotes, right? That I own this car, or I own this house, or I own this money, or I own this, right? All of it belongs to Allah. All of it. Allah is the owner of all of it, right? Because if I'm owned by Allah, then all of what I own is for Allah as well, right? We say, Inna lillahi. We all belong to Allah. We are just custodians of those things for some time, right? We are in charge of those things. I'm in charge of my body, but it's not mine. I'm in charge of my wealth, but it's not really mine, right? So we are custodians of those things. The Abdullah bin Shakhir, he says, he says that the Prophet that I came to the Prophet while he was reading Al-Hakum al-Takathur, right? That your desire for accumulating wealth has distracted you, has misguided you. Right? He's reading that surah, and then the Prophet he said that even the child of Adam says, my wealth, my wealth. Right? He always says, my wealth, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Right? This is something common to say. While his wealth, so he says, the Prophet said, the child of Adam says, my wealth, my wealth. Is there anything for your wealth, O child of Adam, which belongs to you except for what you have eaten and digested? Or what you have worn, meaning clothing, and worn out? And what you have given in charity and sent forth for the next life, right? So all of what has been used, that you can consider yours. Whatever is left is not necessarily yours. So one time a person came to Sayyidah Aisha, and she knocked on the door and she asked for food. The person asked for food. So Sayyidah Aisha gave some meat. They had recently slaughtered the goats. So another person came, and she continued to give charity of this meat until the Prophet ﷺ came. And she said to the Prophet ﷺ that I saved, we only have the shoulder left of the goats, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, no, we have everything but the shoulder. Meaning, what you've given, that's ours. Now we have, you can say, obtained it and made it certain that on the Day of Judgment we will get the reward for that. But as far as this last shoulder, what are we going to gain the pleasure of Allah with? Or we're not going to, right? It's not ours until it's. So what you have given, what you've put forth, is guaranteed yours. So lastly, that preparation for the death, that the Prophet ﷺ said that the smart person is the one who takes himself into account and lives their life according to, for that which is after death. And this is something that the Prophet reminded us constantly to remember, which is death. And Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan, whenever he would see the graveyard, he would start to cry. But in the gatherings of the Prophet ﷺ, when they're talking about hellfire and all of the punishments of the next life, he didn't cry. So the Sahaba, they noticed this. And they're very intuitive people. So they asked him, how come when you're talking about hell, you don't cry, but you see a grave, you start crying, you start weeping? So he said that I heard the Prophet ﷺ said that the grave is the first stage amongst the stages of the next life. Whoever has an easy time in this, whoever succeeds in that, then everything after it is easier. And so the amount of stress they have on the how that they end their life. So the Prophet ﷺ end with these last couple hadith. Actually, there's one more here. Yeah, so the Prophet ﷺ said that a man may do good deeds for 70 years, but if he acts unjustly when he leaves his last testament, the wickedness of his deed will be sealed upon him, and he will enter the fire. If, on the other hand, a man acts wickedly for 70 years, but just in his last will and testament, the goodness of his, but he is just in his last will and testament, the goodness of his deed will be sealed upon him, and he will enter the garden. Right? So this goes back to the principle the Prophet taught us, that everything, that actions are based on their endings. Right? The way a person ends their life is the most important. How they were as when they were younger, how they were in the earlier days, that can be rectified by the end. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that man hadarat al-wafatu fa-awsa. Whoever is approached by death and he leaves a bequest, he leaves this will, and his bequest is according to the book of Allah, it is an expiation for all the zakat that he has left in his life. All the times he didn't pay the zakat. And then lastly, narrated by Jabir ibn Abdullah, that the Prophet said, whoever dies while having a will, then he dies on the straight path and on the sunnah. And he dies with taqwa, and he dies as a martyr, and he dies as a person who is forgiving. So we hope, inshallah, that this the details of what's coming, that we take a lot of importance and we take notes and we try to fulfill this, and that we hasten to fulfill this and have it written and have it, and then one will have a lot more tranquility, knowing that if I die today, then there is clear instructions of what to do, how to take care of it, especially in a country that is not doesn't follow direct Islamic laws. Right? To be even more careful about burials and all of these things. So inshallah we return the mic to Sheikh Faraz. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Starting in just a second, we have a handout that we're giving out. But I have a funny relationship with inheritance. When I was in Damascus, I didn't own a computer in Damascus, but computers were around. I made a bet that to myself, no halal bet, no money involved. Then look, why do you need to study inheritance law and all these complicated calculations? I'm sure they'll have inheritance calculators. So why do you need to do it? So the two of the main books that I studied where we're covering inheritance, I covered it a few times, but once I did it in my back, so I was bedridden for 21 days. I was only able to pray 3 times standing, and each of those times I aggravated the back condition. So Sheikh Zahir actually told him, I tried to pray and I did it in my back. He said, don't do it next time. 3rd time he said, if you try again, I'm going to break your back. I was like, oh. Of course he wasn't shaking. 2nd time, I don't know, I tripped it in, I injured myself, but I missed the section on inheritance. But then I got to study another work, but you have to be careful what you wish for. So before we start, we would like to thank Sheikh Yusuf for an important introduction to the importance of the topic and its religious significance and many of the related considerations. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So, in the opening session we saw the importance of having a will and how that relates to our being ready for the reality of death and the rights we owe our inheritors. Right? And it's part of our gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also the reality that what is the nature of wealth in our hands? It's a trust from Allah. We have it for a period of time. When we die, that trust that Allah has granted us now belongs to the inheritors. So to the extent that we don't give it to whom it rightfully belongs, we die in a state of wrongdoing. So for this, it is very important to keep a living will. And what is the ruling of keeping a living will? Of course, you don't tell people things that will hurt them, but I would prefer to guess that a vast majority of people who went on Hajj, had they not gone on Hajj and made a will first, even if it meant realizing that I shouldn't go on Hajj, they would have been better off in their deen and in their dunya. Why? Because the ruling of having a living will, particularly in a non-Muslim country, is that it is personally obligatory. Right? It's personally obligatory. And it relates to the rights of others. So it is a material obligation that comes before things like Hajj. Because Hajj applies to the situations where you have financial capacity. It is conditional on capacity. And we'll see the living will has implications on how you live out your life as well. And due to the importance of keeping a will, and Sheikh Yusuf shared some of the texts related to it, we see in the hadith related by Imam al-Bukhari and others that it is not permissible for any Muslim, and pardon the typo, who has something, that some wealth, that they would will to stay for 2 nights, to remain for 2 nights without having their last will written and ready. And the 2 nights is for emphasis. It's not a literal matter, but to hasten the matter, right? To hasten the matter and not to delay it. So there is an important aspect related to inheritance, which is that most of the estate that you leave behind has been predetermined. Most of the rulings that you find in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays out the general principles or the general framework. So for example, the prayer, we have the integrals of the prayer mentioned in the Quran, but none of the details are there in the Quran. They are understood from the Sunnah. So the integrals of the prayer, the standing, the recitation, the bowing, the prostration, those are mentioned. But what you recite, how you bow, what you do in the bowing, those are not mentioned. We are commanded to give zakat. But the details and some critical matters related to zakat are mentioned in the Quran. Who is eligible for zakat, for example, but the details of what is zakat due upon and how it's given and when it's given, these are all detailed by the Prophet ﷺ. But when it comes to the rulings of inheritance, they are fully detailed in the Quran. Fully detailed in the Quran. So there is, in the inheritance itself, there's almost no discretionary room in terms of what your inheritors themselves will give. And we'll see that there's one element in which you have discretion, which is up to 1/3 of one's wealth, and there is wisdom in this. There's wisdom in this. One of the wisdoms is that it is to avoid dispute amongst the inheritors. That's one of the wisdoms. Avoid dispute amongst the inheritors, to avoid favoritism amongst the inheritors. And throughout history, there have been all kinds of challenges that different human societies have faced with respect to inheritance. There is a secular Turkish economic historian, I'm not going to mention his name, but he says that one of the reasons, but it's an argument that's been debunked by many Western academics, let alone Muslims, that one of the reasons that Europe experienced the Industrial Revolution and Muslim societies didn't, he said, is due to wealth accumulation. That in Europe, who got the inheritance? And of course, there are different societies, but broadly, the oldest son would get the bulk of the inheritance. So it allowed for a lot of wealth accumulation. But we see that there's a wisdom in inheritance, which includes the aspect of social justice. That it's very hard to just have one person accumulate a lot of wealth, even within the context of family, because intergenerationally, the wealth gets spread out. And that is actually from the social justice of our deen, and it's ultimately far more societally healthy, and it is much more conducive to good family relations, because the inheritance is not just taken by the eldest child, but it is spread amongst the inheritors. So there's a number of wisdoms in it, but it's also a matter of slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That why do we pray in the times we pray? That dimension of the ruling relates to our slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our complete trust in His wisdom, in His justice, and His mercy. Now, a will, if someone died in a Muslim country, you would think that they don't need a will, insofar as the core of their, presumably their wealth would be divided in accordance with Islamic law. But even in a Muslim country, it's important to have a will. Why? One, for the inheritors themselves. Just midweek, a couple came here, the seekers, asking for different advice and so on. A family member had been dead for 20 years in a Muslim country, and they hadn't yet distributed that family member's wealth. And it included lands and properties and factories and a bunch of different things. And technically, there's 20 years of mess, because not only the inheritance, but from the time the person died, the whole estate rightfully belongs to the inheritors in accordance with its rightful division. Now, profit has been earned on that, things have been bought and sold, and all kinds of things. And they still haven't distributed it. And it's caused all kinds of dispute within the family, because many of the children could have benefited from that wealth in different ways, and it leads to all kinds of harms. So even in a Muslim country, it is very important to properly set up a living will. In a non-Muslim country, if you die, the laws of the land will not ensure that your wealth is distributed in accordance with the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that has major implications upon you and also upon your inheritors, both those who are deprived of their rightful share and those who get too much. So that's why having a will, which is legally binding instructions on how to divide your estate, is a personal religious obligation. It is fard ayn, it's personal religious obligation. And there's a number of religious duties related to this, some of which are obligatory, some of which are sunnah or recommended, that we are encouraged to keep in mind. So there are conceptually 5 or 6 main parts of a will. The first part of the will, which seems simple, but it's not quite so simple, which is, who will execute the will? You die, and they can't really consult you that, Zubayr, what are you going to do with you? What's the process by which we're going to divvy this up? Which lawyer are we going to go to? And when things aren't clear, people put things off. So to have someone who will execute the will, someone who is trustworthy, who's responsible, who will follow through on it. It can be an immediate family member. It can be someone trusted in one's circles of association. It could be an elder in the community. It could be a scholar. It could be a lawyer. Right? But this is very important. Right? And they should, of course, know that they've been requested to execute the will, etc. So that when the person dies, they are properly notified of this. And this is one of the key components to ensure that your will is executed without undue delay and in a sound and enforceable manner. So that's number one. Number two, there's a number of things that are not material, but that you may want to include in your will. Including, for example, things like guardianship of the children, if someone was the last remaining parent. Right? So the wife died while the couple still had small children. Now the husband remains, or vice versa. The mother remains, and if she dies, who's going to take care of the children? Right? So that's something practically to include. Issues related to the guardianship, because the parents have a say in that. And if they don't specify that, then your different members of the family will come up with different arguments and so on, and the parents have a right to consider that. And also details related to the funerals, and we'll talk about those. And we'll be coming to the details related to specifying one's wishes there. Go ahead.
Are there any qualifications required of an executor?
Technically, you could, anybody could be asked to step into that role. It is good if, practically, to have someone who has experience handling that. Right? And in some families who've been, who've got large families, there's people who know. Right? They may not necessarily be scholars, etc., but there are, I know multiple families in the Greater Toronto area who have at least 300 immediate family members, etc. So there are people within the family who deal with these kinds of things, especially people who are connected within the community. So if they're given the responsibility, they know who to ask, etc. They can take on the responsibility. Right? That's why, depending on one's circumstance, someone who's close to scholars or particular trusted community leaders, elders, sometimes they ask them because they've dealt with it many, many times. It's very straightforward. And as one of the scholars said, that making a living will is much simpler than doing your taxes. Right? So, it's not that difficult. Right? But it should be someone trustworthy, who will take on the responsibility, who will consult as needed, and also whom the inheritors will respect. Okay? Sometimes it is wise to have the remaining spouse, etc. In other cases, it's not. Right? Because if the kids are estranged with the father, and you appoint the husband to execute the will, then that obviously can lead to, there's not one, one needs to consider one's circumstances in that. Now, before any consideration applies as to how you divide your wealth, the first thing you need to look at is clearing your debts. And we look that there's two types of debts. There's debts you owe people, and there's debts you owe to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how you handle the two of them. You can devote up to 1/3 of your estate as a wasiyah, as a discretionary gift. And we'll touch upon some of the considerations related to that. You cannot give it to an inheritor, but there's a wide range of other considerations that can apply to discretionary gifts, and many people lose out on a lot of opportunities for good from this component of their inheritance. The fifth is the inheritance itself. So we're going to tackle these one by one to look at the parts of the will. I apologize, I'm really bad with numbers, should say part 2. Right? The parts of the will. So defining the executor, right? This has a, as we mentioned, consider in your circles of association who's someone who's trustworthy, who's responsible, ideally who are either experienced themselves or who will consult as needed. Right? Those are the broad considerations. It does not need to be a scholar or some community leader, etc. Sometimes it is helpful. A number of the masajid, for example, in our community, do handle this. Others don't handle it particularly.
Will the state accept that? I mean, the state laws, will they accept that a scholar will distribute the...
No. So one needs to make the will. That's one of the important considerations with respect to the will that we'll touch upon. Yeah, that you need to ensure that the way you structure your will is sound according to in our case Canadian law, the laws of the land, wherever you may be. And for that, there's a couple of steps that we would suggest. Right? So you should construct your own will. Right? There's a few options. There's a number of templates that you can base it on. There's a number of lawyers that provide professional services where they have, they help you structure the template and so on. But ultimately, it's one's own responsibility. And then once you get that, it's good if you rely on a template or some service. But it's especially when there's significant wealth involved. Consult a lawyer. It doesn't cost much because it's not a very complicated document. Typically, in one consultation, they'll go to do it just to go through and make sure that that the will is sound. If it's a very simple case, like a small little family, there's only one inheritor, the Islamic will calculation would be very simple. But there's cases where it's very complicated. Someone has, there's multiple children from multiple sides and this and that, a whole bunch of complications. It's just good to run it by somebody that this is the calculations I got for the Islamic inheritance component. Is this correct? So that's why defining an executor, it's really up to one's discretion who it is, right? Because they're not deciding how your estate will be divided. They are simply executing your wishes, right? And if the wishes are set up in a manner that is legally sound, then the basis is that that a person has the discretion to distribute their wealth as they wish. But there are some considerations. One, which is why wording is important. That one is not wronging, one spouse, etc. There's laws to take that into account. But overall, so far the experience has been that, that across Canada, the courts, don't problematize an estate apportioned according to, our religious teachings. So that's the only consideration is to do so in a manner that, that it has to be laid out properly in the inheritance. We'll touch upon that when it comes to the inheritance itself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A little bit and to keep in mind, as you mentioned just now, that obviously the person is writing the will to comply with the laws of Allah according to the Sharia. On the other hand, you said that we should make it in such a way that it should seem sound according to the law of Canadian government as well. How these two will reconcile?
No, because how will we reconcile? One is we don't see a fundamental, sometimes we view your Sharia to be some foreign object, right? And one thing to keep in mind that there's the overall considerations within divine guidance. The Sharia is the preservation of human interest, right? And the prevention of harm. So, there's one young angry man one day was explaining something about respecting the law of the land in running your business, etc. I said, why should we care about the law of the land, etc., when it's against the law of Allah? I said, do you know anything about Canadian law? He said, and he was shockingly for someone who didn't believe in following the law of the land, he was actually studying law. Which is kind of ironic, right? So I said, so do you know anything about commercial law? Yeah. He was a bit angry. I wanted to tell him, like, chill out. I said, okay. Have you studied fiqh at all? He said, a little bit. I said, okay. Can you list what Canadian laws in commercial law go against the teachings of the Sharia? Right? And I can't think of it. I said, I can think of a few, but I'm not going to tell you. but even when there are some issues that would be problematic, it's only that they allow something that is not allowed in the Sharia. Right? Or in personal law. Right? In personal law. Right? That they may allow certain things that the Sharia does not allow, and there are certain limitations, yes, but there are exceptions. Like in Canada, multiple marriage is not allowed. That's a constraint. But what does it compel you to do that is not allowed in the Sharia? Right? That is an obligation upon you in the Sharia that the law of the land here does not permit you to do. You'd be hard pressed to think of examples. Right? It's hard to make an Islamic argument intrinsically for wearing a seatbelt. Right? Intrinsically. But it's the law of the land, you need to respect it. Right? There's a strong libertarian streak within Islamic law as well. It's very hard to make the case that wearing a seatbelt failing to wear a seatbelt is a clear and compelling harm. It's hard to make that argument. But there is an interest, recognizable interest there, so if it is the law of the land, you are compelled to follow it. Right? And many of these laws are based on discretion, but you have to respect the law of the land. I sat in a car where we went 155 kilometers an hour, and the guy was going slow in Germany on the way to Frankfurt. Dr. Mahmoud Kellner was riding 155, there's people going 180, 190, 200. He was in the slow lane. Right? In Canada, you get your license revoked for something like that. So those are discretionary, but no one's forcing you to do something that is not allowed in the Sharia. So the scope of that, right? And the reason I just wanted to take a little bit of digression that sometimes we imagine that the law of Allah is something like we have to live a parallel life from the life in the society around us, and that's not the case. That there's certain things that Allah has obligated us for us to do, and we do those, etc. But but the general rules that we uphold, there is a large overlap between what Allah has commanded and what you find in laws in society. We have to make sure to check that what we're doing is sound according to both in our public lives, right? And if we did, we'd benefit. Even when it comes to commercial law, there's many practices in prevalent contracts that if people studied Islamic law, they would find a lot of benefit in avoiding conditions that are excessive, that pose undue limitations on the other party, etc. They would simplify their contracts. But when it comes to the laws of the land, being in any land is a legal act, right? In that, if you are born in a country, you are agreeing de facto to abide by the laws of the land. If you move to a country and become resident, you are agreeing explicitly or de facto to adhere to the laws of the land. The scholars say even if you enter the country illegally, if you choose to remain there, and of course being illegal is problematic, but if you do remain there, keeping aside the matter that you entered illegally, you have de facto acquiesced to following the laws of the land. Right? And if you don't wish to acquiesce to the laws of the land, then your duty is to leave. your duty is to leave. You don't have an intrinsic right to remain in a land and disobey its general laws. So that is very clear in Islamic teachings. So there's, Canadian law, for example, most Western law does not impose any specific requirements on you on how you distribute your estate. There are some broad considerations. There are some broad considerations of, if you have dependents who are needy, etc., that their interests are kept in mind, and we'll look at, how you can ensure that that's covered. So that's the matter of the executor. The funerary, there's some funerary arrangements that, properly speaking, the person who dies is the first person responsible for their funeral, because you're the person who died. So you're responsible for your funerary arrangements. And it's also mercy on the family, because when you die, you stop living, but now they have to deal with, okay, what do we do next? It's mercy on them that you took care of this, right? So the key funerary details, right? That I'd like to be washed at such, I'd like such and such, masjid, whatever, to handle the washing, the ghusl, the prayer, the burial, etc. And there's also an opportunity for many things, right? That if you think about where would you like to be, these rites to take place, because it has significance not only for you but for the family. Because if you attend enough janazas in our community, some of them are remarkably well handled. Others, it's just mercy from Allah that fights don't break out. Right? Right? Because it's handled rather poorly. Right? And as time goes on, people have less and less patience with anything religious, even within our community. So this is an area where considering what are the options, how can where can it be handled in an Islamically proper manner that also will be considerate, and also very often one of the best times to help people reconnect with religion, to reconnect with community, to reconnect with other Muslims, is at the point of death. Because even those from within family who won't even come to Eid prayer, they are likely to show up to the janazah prayer. Okay? So one should consider accordingly and make arrangements. Outside of the context of making a will, we of course as a community, if people wanted to get involved in the community and provide an invaluable service, if you could turn your Islamic center into a center of excellence when it comes to funerary services, it's a great door of da'wah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just to handle it well. Right? Both for the deceased, but also for the people who come. Or at least to help them, provide resources, etc. Someone just experienced death. In our whole community, I've never seen, just have a small booklet, how, on death and dying. Right? Some little resource. And what are du'as you can recite for the deceased? How can you do something for the deceased? What should the family do? Right? Little things like that. These are great doors of benefit in the community. But this is something that's encouraged to specify, and per se, the deceased should specify that the funerary expenses be taken out from their estate. So it's a good practice to set aside that amount of money, right? Because you don't know when you're going to die. And it's a very common occurrence. People die and then there's a scramble because it's $6,000-$7,000 or more for the funerary costs and the cemetery plot, etc., all these different costs. It's not cheap to die. And so making those arrangements relieves the burden from your family.
Can you buy a land also in a graveyard, or?
Yeah, and from that is you can take care of some of these things in advance to get a plot of land, etc. That's also from being ready. And some families who wish to be buried next to each other, they get several plots of land early, etc. One of my friends got taken, spent several hours, and he's a scholar actually, spent several hours in jail because what he did was he read some of the early Muslims from like the first generations of Islam. To remind themselves of death, they dug a hole in the back of their house and they'd go and sit there to reflect on the reality of death once in a while. So he decided to do that. And
So why would that
yeah,
lead
but
to
then
jail?
step 2, what happened? Then he decided to do a seminar on funerary practices. So he took the class to his backyard, and they had a shrouded body, but it wasn't a real body, right? And they lowered it into the grave just for demonstration purposes. They thought that they were planting a bomb or something. So it was a big controversy. The neighbors called the police, and they thought that they were some kind of terrorist plot. But it wasn't. It was just practicing for death. But taking care of these things, you can do a lot of this in advance. Some Islamic centers allow you have arrangements where you can pay up in advance for these services as well. There's some communities, I don't know if they do it here, but in the U.S., it's a very nice cooperative system where like people who are part of a masjid, they have like a takaful system, a cooperative insurance system where if you pay up a certain fee on a monthly basis, there's certain services that they'll take care of on behalf of yourself and your family, and that's a good practice. And they also keep an extra so that there's other needy members of the family, but they use some. The masjid I saw it in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Rabbani community. The Rabbans are tough people. So those who committed but weren't paying it, first thing you see in the masjid, not paid up for last 3 months, you can list those people. That's a shame them into. So I asked the Imam, why did they do that? I said, how else will not people pay up? But it's also, these are good things to be thinking about as a community, right? That how do we help take care of funerary and other costs for the wider community.
Sure.
Yeah.
How would the family immediately get to know of whether you do have a will? Or...
Yeah, so we'll talk about that towards the end. That how do you make them know about that? One that relates to the executor is that you inform the executor of your will and where it is, etc. And we use technology for all kinds of other things. If you have a living will, you could share the document. Okay, so that people can find out. Then, sorry, I think your photocopy came out. There's another consideration with respect to wishes that you can specify, is to specify within your will that you wish the execution of the will to be expedited, and you want the clearance of the debts to be expedited, and that's important because a lot of family members say, well, we're right now in mourning, and then this happened, and then so on, and it gets put off, right? But as family members, we need to be aware, especially with debts, that debts are a burden on the person who dies. So really, to try to clear that is one of the most urgent of needs, and that's why having a mature executor is important. Okay? Which is why, and very often, like when there'd be gatherings within family, etc., and people sit to recite Quran. I typically not sit and recite Quran. I talk to the immediate family members on the practical things that they need to handle. So the family members came and said, Sheikh Saab, what is this? You tell us all to sit, read Quran, and you are walking around talking to people? But of course, I didn't set up the Quran gathering, but reciting Quran for the deceased is recommended. But taking care of their debts is an obligation. Right? And helping them to take care of that, that is something that even within family, and this is something that we should be part of, practically assisting people in prioritizing, but with wisdom. So that, under wishes, you have also, the quick execution of the will, the clearance of the debts, and we talked about guardianship, to specify who would be a guardian to one's children, particularly in the event, because sometimes it's obvious, and both parents are alive if one were to die, but the scholars say even then it's good to specify who would, because what if both parents die? They die in a car accident, etc. So there's something, and these are practical things to think about. Like we don't, the believer doesn't approach death with a false sense of fear. And a lot of people, it's like, death is not something you talk about. Right? Death, you don't think about it. Like, why are you being negative? No. Our attitude towards death is very healthy. Death is an important step in the journey of our soul. So just as you prepare, for anything else, you prepare for it, and you don't feel shy of that conversation. So both spouses should talk about that. That what if both of us died? Who would we want to be the guardian for our children? Especially when they're not mature adults yet, right? So that's also something significant. And especially when we often don't live in the context of extended families and so on, this can be very complicated. And any questions here before we continue? Go ahead.
Can we appoint our spouses as the executor?
Can you appoint the spouse as an executor?
Yeah.
Yes. But should you appoint the spouse as an executor depends on the circumstance. And particularly, one of the very sensitive situations that arises is the family home. Right? If they own one home, right? If one spouse dies, the other spouse has the home, what happens to the home? And this is one of the sensitive issues that we'll look at in just a bit. It causes a lot of complications. Because they say, according to the will, I, who am executing the will, have the house. And sadly, now, law doesn't only look at ideas, it looks at realities. It is very common for families to break apart upon the death of one of the parents. Why? With the kind of diets we have, people dying in their 60s, at best in their 70s, their kids are in their 30s, 40s, just getting established in life, and they have this $1 million home, $2 million home. That's a lot of money. So mom, you should downgrade. And then mom says, but I am the executor of the will. It sometimes is, and it depends on the family dynamics as well, but don't be optimistic about that. Which is why it's often helpful to get,
Will you come to situations or cases where a will could be overwritten, or because of something maybe perhaps that's not practical?
Yeah, so there are parts of a will that the executor can overlook. Okay. There's a historical example of that. One of the great Hanafi scholars, Imam Badruddin al-Aini, he had an issue with the nature of the waqf, the endowment of Al-Azhar, because of who endowed it and how they endowed it. So Imam al-Aini used to teach at Al-Azhar, but he taught at a madrasa not far from the Azhar. So he made, and he was one of the great scholars of his age, from the 9th Islamic century. In his will was that he will not be prayed over at Al-Azhar, but rather he wanted to be prayed at from his madrasa or wherever. That wasn't big enough. So the individual executing his will consulted the ulama. They said it's in the public interest for him to be prayed out at Al-Azhar because the people of Cairo came out in droves for this great righteous scholar, one of the two great commentators of Sahih al-Bukhari. So they overrode that will. Or, for example, if someone specifies a particular person to lead the prayer, right? And that's one of the really tricky things, but the person who's responsible for executing the will, it may cause serious problems in the family or in the community if that happens. So that those aren't the fundamentals of the will, but these kinds of details. Or if they specify, now there are elements where it gets tricky. What if they specify something that is against the Sharia, but it is written in their will, and the law of the land would uphold what is in the will.
Yeah.
And that's very sensitive. That's very sensitive. And there one has a moral responsibility not to go against the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but an intelligent person does nothing to harm themselves either. Because if you uphold the rule, the Sharia there, you will be making yourself personally liable in court. In that case, it is best to it's best to consult, because the practical thing there is to try to get a consensus of the inheritors that, look, this is what the father or whoever passed away specified, this is how it is in Islamic law. So to get the inheritors all to agree to do the right thing. And if they do that, then you've absolved yourself, right? Because let's say there's 5 inheritors, they agree that notwithstanding the will, this is how we all agree in writing to distribute it, then you have covered your bases as well. But before we look at the actual, go ahead.
In the construction of a will for someone who's elderly and they're suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, how would one go about that? Should someone be in power of attorney, or is there a different legal matter behind it?
Yeah, so legally, if someone if someone starts getting some kind of degenerative condition, right, or something that's affecting their mental capacity, they should preemptively appoint someone. They should preemptively give someone power of attorney on their behalf. And there's many ways you can give general power of attorney or specific or contingent power of attorney, that in the event of loss of this, so and so is in charge of my affairs. So if one does that, then that person, and there's people, I have a friend who in his early 40s got diagnosed with, a degenerative condition, and he has very limited capacity as a result. But you specify that in advance of when someone loses capacity. That's the ideal case. Otherwise, one needs to consult lawyers on how one would go about constructing their will, because that gets very messy. But in those difficult cases, a thing to do is to bring the family together, right? To bring the family together rather than just the eldest son going. And in general, that's one of the things with the difficult life decisions, right? The difficult life decisions is to bring the family together, and it's best to do it in writing so that afterwards no one second guesses, to agree together that we will proceed in the following way. So that avoids later contention. It's also legally enforceable, right? Because these are the main inheritors, they agree that this is what we'll do. That is much stronger. Of course, from the discretionary things that we didn't mention, it's not really directly related to the living will, but it has a lot of considerations in our times, is the issue of what, which is a whole range of end-of-life issues in terms of medical treatment and what medical treatment one wants and what medical treatment one wants to opt out of. Organ donation as well. Those are things that one can. Of course, there's other mechanisms to, opt into the organ donor program, etc. But those are things one could also include in one's will, because sometimes one opted into it and nobody realized it, or they delayed. Especially, with Muslims, often, if the inheritors aren't aware that the person wanted to donate an organ, right, it goes to the morgue, etc. Then it's too late after that to do the organ donation. So organ donation, these are discretionary matters that one can build up into the will. Also end of life issues. There's a number of good books on how to think about just the worldly aspects of end of life issues. One of them is by an American physician named Atul Gawande. I think called Being Mortal. It's not a religious guide, but just thinking through a lot of the end of life issues. And Islamically, you're not obligated to indefinitely pursue medical treatment. Okay? There's no obligation to pursue medical treatment. Now, you cannot take a means to end your life, right? So any kind of assisted suicide is not permitted, but remaining on life support, right, is not an obligation. It is recommended when there's reasonable chance of recovery, but it's not an obligation. Now that's a big topic. Separately, we have some resources on seekers related to it, and there's like how does one handle those sensitive scenarios, but a person can specify in their will how that will be handled. Go ahead.
Okay, the imaginary scenario you put forward just a few minutes back, that if there are certain conditions in the will by the deceased which contradicts with Sharia, in that situation, the person, the executor, should try to bring the family together to bring them to a consensus. Suppose it doesn't happen. In that case, can the executor stand back and say that I cannot execute this will?
Yeah, that's their moral responsibility, right?
But legally, will it be allowed for a person? Because he'll be sinful in the other situation if he executes that.
No, but you're not obligated. So, let's say I appointed an old friend to execute my will. It's like, man, that's a messy situation. And he says, sorry, I can't do it. Now, if it's being unreasonable, just because you just want to get on with life, that'd be irresponsible. But if there are genuine issues that is beyond the person's capacity or put them in liability, etc., then they can hand it on. Which is why it is also sometimes good to specify more than one executor. So in the event of the first not being available, then this person and that person. And sometimes in some scholars suggest appointing an organization if you trust an organization, but that gets messy too. It really depends on the community and the family context, etc. But we can appoint a range of potential inheritors. But very often, if with wisdom and tact, very often it is possible to steer the inheritors towards coming to a reasonable solution. Especially if one makes it practical, right? And the way to handle this is to be solution-oriented. To give a practical solution. Look, this is the way forward. It'll solve the whole issue. Okay. The third area that needs attention is, so we've got the funerally expense, and that's where the numbering is way off, is debts that you owe. Right? In general, debts to humans are given precedence to the rights of the inheritors, even if it takes the whole amount of the estate. Right? Debts, material debts to humans. So it's important in keeping a living will to keep track of one's primary debts. whether those debts be to individuals or to institutions. Right? Whether the debts are to individuals or to institutions. You have some financing, etc. You have to keep track of those major debts and the relevant details related to those, so that in the event of death, those can be handled in a sound manner. In general, taking on debt is something that is discouraged religiously. Right? There is a debt that's a purposeful debt, right? That's a controlled debt that can be readily repaid. You could even be rewarded for taking on some, halal debt. In that, for example, if someone is earning but they don't quite have enough for the marriage expenses or the mahar, you could be rewarded for taking on a good debt like that. But taking on unnecessary, undue debt is discouraged. But keeping track of the debts in a living will that you update is good. Okay? And especially if someone has more wealth and they have someone who does their finances for them, etc., to put that information there as well. Okay? And many people who are registered as they've incorporated. Many professionals incorporate or register as consultants, etc. So have someone doing their accounting, etc. So that person would know their financial situation. It's good to put that, because eventually someone will have to work through all of that. The more you make clear in your living will, the safer you are in being able to discharge those debts, and the easier you make it on those who are discharging it. So this is both debts to humans and to institutions, whether it be loans or other types of financing that one has. But there's also other types of debts that one has, right, that one needs to be aware of, right, which are borrowed items, particularly if significant. And in general, be careful of borrowing, because they say borrowing has a resemblance to a debt, but also has a resemblance to theft, right? In that, you take something that belongs to another and you don't give it back to them. And that resembles what in Sharia is called ghasb, wrongful. It's called misappropriation, right? And you wrongfully took another person's wealth. So practically, it's a good practice to keep track of anything that you borrowed. If it's significant, you would include it in the living will. If it's not significant, the recommendation with items borrowed is don't mix them with your own property. Hasten to give them back. Okay? So, because the tricky thing with items borrowed have a material value, but they also have a non-material value very often. Right? That, let's say, this cup, how much would this cup be worth?
$20.
What? Okay, no, let's ask this sister. How much would this cup be worth?
Maximum $2.
No, but it's got the...
Where do you guys get your cups from, man?
Thank you.
No, with a nice design on it. And,
25.
okay, whatever. Let's consensus $20 cup, right? So it's not worth that much, right? But I was gifted this cup in Osnabrück in Germany, and I just gave it away, to be honest. I gave it to my wife. I don't know what she's done with it. I got tea in it. But let's say it has non-material value. It's gifted to me by, so it has certain value. I wanted to give it to my daughter, whatever. So someone borrowed it, they don't give it back. There's a material component, but there's also the non-material component.
Emotional.
Yeah, and that's recognized in the Sharia. Okay? So in general, be very careful about items borrowed. Okay? In general in life. many of the scholars they suggest that anything that you can give back immediately, someone sends you food, the righteous, what they would do, they'd empty out the container. They said, can you hold on a second? You empty out the container, wash it, give it back. Or at least keep them separate. One of my friends, he borrowed a lot of books. But all of us felt safe lending Ustad Faisal books because he kept a separate shelf where he kept the books that he borrowed from others. And man, there are loads of books. But he had a tagging system for whom he borrowed the books from, and he'd keep a list of whose books he borrowed. And so that if something happened, it'd be like he had a who's who guide of how to give that. And there's no harm. If you're not sure about, if you're bad with borrowing, don't borrow. Just recently someone gave back a whole bunch of books. All of them I had bought other copies because I had written them off as lost. It was a big surprise. Oh, that's where they were. Now, I write off my books anyways, but this, so this is, items borrowed when they're of significance. Right now you're driving someone's car. You could die, but the car could survive. So those kinds of things, or other things that have material value, and within family, etc., that's not uncommon, okay, to define items borrowed. The other type of debt, one must also clear one's debts to Allah. But clearing the debts to Allah is a little more tricky, because as relates to your estate, whose right is given precedence? Your inheritors or the rights you owe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The inheritors, because the inheritors are needy, Allah is free of need. So the debts you owe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can only be taken from the discretionary 1/3 of your estate. What are the debts owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? There is an expiation for unperformed fasts. If you are someone who is able to perform Hajj and did not do so, you need to pay for someone to do Hajj on your behalf. Now you can't just say, oh, when I die, I'll just get someone to do Hajj on my behalf, because delaying it in that way is sinful. But if you fail to do so, you need to keep that in mind. And in the Hanafi school, you also pay expiation for every missed obligatory prayer. Okay? So debts owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are only taken from the discretionary 1/3, not beyond, unless the inheritors agree. If these debts add up to a lot, okay, and so it happened, actually, a good friend of mine from the UK, and this is good 15 years ago, his father passed away. The total amount he owed for decades of non-performance of prayer and fast and this and that, and later in life, uncle started praying, was over £250,000. Now he didn't have that much left. One of the wisdoms in this, when the family got together, let's see what we'll do. The younger brother, who didn't used to pray, started praying. He said, man, that's expensive. So he started praying. Now, I didn't see why that made sense, but sometimes things like that, there's a wisdom for the living too. But practically, of course, this does not absolve you of the action. You are sinful for the action, but the basis of the believer is that if they did something wrong, they try to rectify. Right? So this is a type of expiation. It's not a substitute. You cannot just leave prayer and just make a payment at the end of your life. But this is a way of expressing your remorse to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If this adds up to more than 1/3, one should consult a trustworthy scholar regarding this. The expiation for a missed fast is the monetary value of about 2 kilos of wheat. Which the monetary value I keep getting wrong, but there's a number of calculating the guides for for making your will that give the guideline for considering it. It's very simple to figure out. And we're working on a inherit like a living will generator for seekers, just as a free service. But for every missed fast, this is textually established by the Quran, right? That if someone in the Hanafi school, the same expiation for one missed fast is due for every prayer. So you do 12 kilos of wheat for every day of prayer missed.
But Sheikh, do we find the evidence in fiqh al-salah for this?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the Hanafi school is the majority school of Islamic scholarship throughout Islamic history, right? So we have.
That doesn't come from Quran, but does it come from
Yes.
Mutawatir hadith or Sahih hadith?
So that we have a number of answers on seekers related to that, but this is it's understood by PS from those texts, and was the understanding of a number of the leading companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam,
Comes from qiyas?
and through the opinion of a number of leading companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, amongst them Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and a number of other leading companions. So this is and this is a matter where there is difference of opinion within Islamic scholarship, but this is so both opinions exist. Whoever follows the Hanafi school, but this is what their opinion is. In some of the other schools, it's not the position, and we have a number of answers that give the legal background for both, and the reality of difference of opinion. This is difference of opinion only arise when the primary texts are not clear and decisive. If they're clear and decisive, there would not be, by definition, difference of opinion about them. And on most legal matters, it's like Imam Shafi'i said, الناس عيال على أبي حنيفة في الفقه. People before Abu Hanifa are like children when it comes to fiqh. Right? Like, if betting were halal, you wouldn't be doing yourself a favor by betting against Abu Hanifa on a legal matter, because as Imam Malik said, if you wanted to argue that this pillar is made of gold, in the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, he could make the argument. But everyone can be sound or err, but these are matters of ijtihad. There's also expiation. If one was able to perform Hajj but failed to do so, one would also specify, having someone perform Hajj on one's behalf, and to try to set aside the funds for that. But that can only be taken from up to 1/3 of one's will. Now, one of the practical benefits of keeping a living will is that and updating it, is that the closer you are to entering your grave with a clean slate, the better off you are. Right? That what do you do with your missed prayers? Get them done. What do you do with your missed fasts? Get them done. Of course, with missed prayers, there's scholarly consensus that they must be made up. Right? Imam Nawawi says there's no recognized difference of opinion on this until Ali ibn Hazm stated that it was not required, but that's after clear ijma' was established, and that's from his literalism. Now, if the debts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amount to more than 1/3, then consult a trustworthy faqih, because there's two conflicting interests. To try to clear the dues of the dead, but also the living have their interests as well. Okay? So consult of how to handle it, and how to handle it in a balanced manner. But if it's a little more than that, the inheritors can come together and say, we all agree to just take out a little, rather than the 1/3 maximum, we'll take it out up to 40%, 45%. And if they agree to do that, that's recommended. Nobody can be obliged to do that, nor can be forced into do that even through just pressure. Go ahead.
So that's the matter of
of debts, what if there's money owed to the deceased? Can you speak to that? So is it incumbent upon the executor or those who remain to recover that, or if that money was owed, say, to one of the inheritors, is that amount to be subtracted from what they would receive?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's a good point. Maybe it's a hair loss. Clearer thinking. No, that's a good point. No, because most people who talk about that don't actually mention that in preparing a living will, right? You made my day, actually. Stuff like that. That's a really good point. Presumably, if somebody has a lot of money owed, then that's something that they should include as well, right? Because that money, and especially in certain families, etc., there are people who have more wealth. They lend money to help people get married and so on, and those things that should be kept track of as well. And if there's certain things that they want to write off, they can specify that, right? So someone, like I know a number of people who, for example, help people in the family get married, and they have it in mind that they don't ask, I won't give it back. Don't leave things hanging like that. So that's a good point, that money owed should be included in there. And if there's certain things that, okay, someone specified, you lent someone $40,000 to get married, and now they don't really look like they're paying, but you don't want to put them in a difficult situation. You can put there that this is money that was owed, but I absolve them of it. And that's the person's right as well, within reasonable limits. If it comes up to a lot, it go beyond the third, then it'll get tricky. But most people don't lend that much in our society, but it could be a case.
You were mentioning about Hajj, we should include that in our debts to Allah. If when we're living, the consideration is that if you're not financially able, it's something that is not incumbent upon you. Once you're deceased, are you supposed to still have it?
That's only if Hajj became obligatory on you, right? So that you fulfill the conditions of the obligation on Hajj, but someone failed to perform Hajj, that's something they should include in their will. So let's say someone, right now, let's say they're able to do Hajj, but then they had a temporary health condition, right? For a couple of years, not able to do Hajj, or they have a particular family situation or work situation, they're not able to do Hajj. The benefit of keeping a living will, what is, one keeps track of that in there, that I have Hajj that's due upon me, and part of the benefit of having a living will, so, and if you periodically review it, say, I need to handle this sooner rather than later. Right? Why? How? By performing Hajj, or taking the means. Then the fourth element of a living will is bequests, right? And so the first principle related to bequests is you can only allocate the bequest to a non-inheritor, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, "La wasiyata liwarith." There can be no bequest to an inheritor, right? And that's to avoid any kind of favoritism, etc. So that's the first component. Secondly, that because inheritors are only eligible for their specified share. A bequest can only be taken maximally from 1/3 of your wealth. But that 1/3 would also exclude any debts that you owed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that were taken out from your estate. So any expiations for missed acts of worship, etc., will be taken out from there. Any bequest that is made will be taken from there. Now, bequests are a big opportunity in a number of ways. I spent a few days at a Jewish seminary in New York City. It was part of a program. I don't normally go to those kind of programs. It's a very interesting. So, two of the rabbis who were both they're legal scholars. They were very fascinated at the idea that there weren't really serious Muslim seminaries in North America. They're giving loads of advice. One of them said, you know how you should fund your seminary? I said, how? He said, bequests. That's how we fund our seminary. I said, no. But you know, they said, you know, we have a lot more wealth than you guys do. But when use a funny term for old folk, when you know, old cronies die, they leave us piles of money. But what you can include in your bequest, there's a whole number of things, right? One is that there are people who don't inherit from you, but you may want, for different considerations, to include them in your estate. That could include, for example, in some families, you may have a situation where you adopted a child, right? You adopted a child. Now, the adopted child does not automatically inherit, but particularly in a situation where they grew up with the other children, etc., you can specify for them to be part of the inheritance as well. How? For you to partake from estate from the discretionary 1/3. Right? Now, you're not obligated to do that, but that's praiseworthy, particularly, you know, so they don't feel left out, etc. We know from the Prophet ﷺ that a Muslim does not inherit from a non-Muslim, and a non-Muslim does not inherit from a Muslim. But that applies to the automatic division of the estate. But in situations, someone's a convert, or there's many different scenarios like that, that too is something that one can specify from one's, in the division of one's estate, from one's bequest. Right? And that has, many benefits and wisdoms.
So can you shed more light on that? So if somebody has non-Muslim parents,
Yeah.
The 1/3 rule applies on obviously Muslims. So if somebody has non-Muslim parents, they can specify something in their will.
Yeah, so that's where often, we have a lot of Insta muftis flying around, right? They read a hadith and they say, Muslims do not inherit from non-Muslims. Legally, what is the way wills are distributed in our time? There are no preset laws of inheritance in a place like Canada. So let's say someone's a convert, they have non-Muslim parents, they gave them 75% of their estate. That is by bequest. And that is by bequest. They can take every dollar of that. Right? That is by bequest. That is not considered inheritance. Even when it is inheritance, then if the other inheritors, the other people who received of the inheritance, they have no objection to it, then one can take that too, right?
What's the Arabic term for bequest?
Wasiyya.
Wasiyya is bequest and
The inheritance?
the inheritance.
It's mirath, right?
So mirath, and so bequest is
For
wasiyya.
mirath, you need irth. Both are used. Okay. So what's in the hadith that you need that it's the negations of irth, of automatic inheritance, not of except a bequest within a will. So that's very clear cut, and we have a number of answers on Seeker's Guidance addressing that. So that, so I didn't mention about orphans there, for example. Other people, there's someone who you just want to recognize that or they're a mentor for you in life, or they're a friend who's in financial difficulty, whatever. One can give it to anybody, but not to an inheritor. Charities or causes that you support, but that can only be taken from a maximum. You only have discretion over 1/3 of your estate, so you could specify that, and whatever it is, or causes that you support. And there, related to number 3, is to think about the potential for ongoing charity, because we know that the hadith related by Bukhari and Muslim, and the wording of Imam Muslim is that the Messenger of Allah said, إِذَا مَاتَ الْإِنسَانِ إِنْقَطَعَ عَمَلُهُ. When a person dies, their actions end. إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ. Except from one of 3 things. صَدَقَةٍ جَارِيَةٍ. Ongoing charity. أو علم ينتفع به, or knowledge that continues to be benefited from, أو ولد صالح يدعو له, or a righteous child who makes dua for them. So the ongoing charity, you could specify that in your estate as well, from a portion of it, and that's something praiseworthy. Okay? To think about what can I put some of my estate towards that would be of lasting benefit. And that is a great opportunity as well. Any questions here before we continue?
So I just want to clarify it. 1/3 for Allah, whatever is from Allah. 1/3.
No. So of the whole list, that's a good question. Is that okay? So out of the whole estate, you only have discretion fully over 1/3. 1/3. Good question. Is that okay? Right. So the inheritors do not have, the net, once the debts to people are clear, the minimum they have rights to is 2/3 of your wealth. So clearing the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, plus any bequest that you want to give, all of that needs to fit within 1/3. Within 1/3. It's also a case to clear one's debts early, so you can leave something, so you can make a spiritual investment in terms of ongoing charity, right? And of course, very interestingly, for those who do read, it doesn't hurt. The year that the financial crisis happened, the Massey lectures were given by Margaret Atwood, and her lectures were on debt in the Western literary and cultural tradition, and how basically debt has always, the human experience is that debt is bad news, right? Especially taking on unnecessary debt, right? Is not a particularly good idea. The fifth part is the inheritance itself, right? So as we've emphasized, the inheritors and their shares are predetermined. There's no wiggle room with that. Now, calculating it in our time is very straightforward. So my bet works out in that there are many sound inheritance calculators available. In a simple case, use the calculator, right? But if it's a complicated case and there's half siblings and this and that, these things, run it by someone just to make sure you got it correct. So you have to confirm, with a scholar that you trust. So calculating the inheritance itself is not complicated. Most good inheritance templates, what they give a full schedule, right? Because things can change. You updated your will according to who's alive right now, but you went paragliding and one family member flew out from the paraglide, you try to save them and you fell off as well. Both of you died. So now the calculation in your living will is not correct. You'll see a number of the living wills, they give a whole schedule of who gets what. And the courts recognize that as a schedule. Courts are used to complicated legal documents. So in Islamic will, most of the ones I've seen are between 8 to 20 pages. Okay? I had to once look over a simple purchase by Malaysia's Sharia compliant investment wing. They were in the process of investing in a halal meat company in the US. And it's very simple. They're buying it for 2 installments. The legal documents were 1,600 pages. It was not fun to go through. I mean, they paid me for it. And it was kind of, that's that. I don't care if I'm paid for it. I'm not reading legal documents again. Because it's not worth the waste of time. So.
I have
have a question. If there is a child with special needs
Yeah.
that needs some institution and you're worried about that child,
Yeah.
whether, particularly if it's a female,
Yeah.
can you put a little bit more money
Yeah, so
for
there's
her?
there's a few things to do with that, and that's a very good question, okay? And that's why a living will is important, but also there's a practical thing to do with that is to set aside some funds while alive to help take care of their needs, and that's the cleanest way of doing it, right? So that, let's say someone has a child with particular needs or other circumstances, right? So for example, someone has, or let's say someone has one child who has gone through financial difficulties, right? And they're hard up, the other children are established. It's best in life to put aside some funds for them.
Willingly, like.
Yeah, willingly, in advance, right? And that's the best thing to do, is to take care of those things in life, right? And one of the wisdoms to have a living will is to think about what are other considerations like that arise. So there's someone with disabilities, someone there's so many contingencies that arise, and there are practical ways to deal with that, right? Because the most complicated way and where real human issues arise is at point of inheritance. People get greedy. And don't say, well, they shouldn't, they do, right? That's the thing. Because ultimately, someone's having trouble with, the husband and wife are having trouble because they're living in a tiny home and this and that. Now suddenly you could be eligible for $500,000 if you got your share of the home. The fact that your elderly mother will continue living in the house, her living in a rented apartment sounds very feasible, because then your marriage is not going to end up in divorce or whatever, right? So there's all these complicated cases. So as much as you can clear while alive and clarify while alive is much better. But in those cases, if it's taken care of by the person alive, what they should do is to set aside that money separately from their estate and to make clear that it's been set aside, etc. If it's not, then that is something reasonable to specify in the will, but it's at the discretion of the inheritors, right? It's at the discretion. Now, there's ways around it as well, right? Because what you can do is, let's say, Sister Zubaydah is, a trusted friend of yours or trusted family member. So you have somebody who, one of the inheritors, you want them to be supported by an extra amount of wealth. So you could specify giving that money to a trusted third party to spend on the person. So you can take that out from what? From
The 1/3?
Yeah, discretionary 1/3. But not by directly giving it to the inheritor, but by giving it to a trusted party. So technically the money goes to them, and for them to spend that money on that person. So there's a number of ways to handle those situations. Right? So there's a whole number of things. You can handle it while the person, while alive, to set aside money for something like that. Number two is, within the discretionary 1/3, to appoint a third party, that this goes to that party, in order for them to spend on the needs of the Yusuf. That's allowed. The third case, they could request the inheritors to agree to agree to a specified amount of funds, and one should be reasonable about it, because they also have rights to take care of that person's need. Now, if it's only because, he's young and I want to put him through college in the US, that's a lot, that could be $250,000 right there, right? But if the deceased fails to do that, that is something, then that's part of the wisdom of having a good executor of the will. They should be a trusted person and who's experienced. They can set things up so that if you bring the inheritors together, say, look, you have your disabled sibling or whatever, why don't you all agree to set aside this amount of funds right? And it will count like an ongoing charity on behalf of your father to help that member. And if they willfully agree, that's a very praiseworthy thing. And generally, this is who inherits is immediate family. People tend to be reasonable about it, right? At least that's been my experience seeing people handle it. And the way to do it is not to give it as an idea. Then what do you think about this and that? Is to be solution oriented. I propose this. Make it very specific, right? And to get everyone to opt in. Because if you do it at very much at just an idea phase, people start getting scared of what that'll mean. But if you spell it out fully and then you propose it, well, that makes sense, sure, right? So, any other questions here? Go ahead.
Just one thing that, as you mentioned, that it is the neatest way to take care of the needy while you're alive. So you set aside some amount, obviously some account or somehow. That is also becoming a part of the will at the end of the day when you're not alive.
No, because if you already apportioned it before you pass away, that actually belongs to them.
You just gave it away.
So it automatically goes to them.
Yeah. So for example, like, from when the kids are small, each of them have their bank account where, when they get gifts at Eid, etc., we let them keep a little bit of the money, the rest of the money goes into their bank accounts, right? They don't have access to those accounts until they're older, as much as they want otherwise. And recently they've been vetoed on some spending proposals. But one could set aside an account, right? And when it's within fairness, like the obligation with respect to children is that one spend fairly on them. It does not mean equally, right? Because someone may have exceptional needs, right? So let's say if one has 3 children and one has special needs, you can't say, well, I've calculated I spend $213 on child A and child B, child C, I will only spend up to $213. No. Fairness is that you are not wrongfully favoring one child over the other.
So Sheikh, in that situation, the percentages, the fractions, the ratios given by Sharia can be altered?
Yeah, no, because the laws of inheritance apply on the estate you have when you die. But what you give out during your life, unless it happens in your final sickness, right? Like in the sickness in which you die, if you give out wealth there, the executor, and this actually applies even in Canadian law, right? Someone does funny business, there's cautions related to that, so you're not depriving your spouse of their rights and so on as well. Many people try to, their resentment toward their spouse comes out of their deathbed, right? So even if someone divorces their wife on deathbed, or the wife exercises her right of divorce on deathbed, that's called talaqul far, the talaq of one who's fleeing your material responsibility. The talaq counts, but the person still inherits within the iddah. So those kinds of situations, we can't go into all the specific details, but wealth that is given out before death and before the final sickness, the days before someone dies, that does not enter into the estate because that already belongs to someone else. Now the tricky component, and this is one of the last things that we wanted to touch upon, is what about the family home? Right? What about the family home? And this becomes a major issue, right? Because, especially with home values being as they are now, and how difficult purchasing homes has become for a lot of people, right? This becomes a major issue. Parents want to remain in the house that they were in, right? And one needs to address this in some way. Now, the first thing to determine is who owns the house, Right? Who owns the house legally? Because if you can determine, and that, a lot of times, the house legally is in the name of one spouse. But naturally, let's say the husband dies. Because men have it tough. Like women always say, women's rights, etc. But something's going wrong in life because men died before women. Right? So have some mercy on us too, please. Right? We promise to be nice, but be merciful on us because we die earlier. Right? Uncle dies. Right? The house was in Uncle Jamil's name. But Auntie Jamila, she's lived 50 years in the house. What's she going to say? Who did he get the house for? But he got it for me. I am the love of his life. 50 years together. We fought, we cursed each other, but we loved each other. That's why we were together 50 years. Say, the house belongs to me. And she'll remember that he said, John, this house is yours. Whatever. Now what will the kids say? That's a $2 million home. And they bought it when it was really cheap, but now it's a $2 million home. Kids are all in their 30s, all trying to get established. What are they going to say? Who did the house belong to? Deceased father or the mother? Father. And no, mom, legally it's dad's. Right? Because then it goes. Now, but those are two positions. And very often the siblings will differ. Because one of the siblings who really doesn't care will say, yeah, give it to mom. Others will come up with their own. That's at least two opinions. The third is, how will it be considered in the law of the land? Why? Because the idea of common property law. Right? But then how do you resolve that? Particularly in the context of the inheritance. It gets really messy. So those are at least the three basic possibilities of what claims there would be on the ownership of the house. It either belongs to the husband, the wife of the deceased claims it belongs to her. A case could be made that it belongs 50-50. And then there'll be other permutations. Siblings will start fighting. This extended family, other people will start offering other opinions. Sometimes the same person will give contradictory opinions. Okay? Depending on their mood. Right? So what happens? I wasn't intending to look at these contingent, but in general, right? People, they just jump into the whole messy pot of opinions. So it's very important to be clear about ownership of these things. In marriage, this is something important to be clear on, right? Because if you think economically for a second, if you studied in economics, for many people, there is strong economic incentives to get out of a marriage. Okay? Then you get married, you got a house, having some challenges in marriage. If you opt out at the right time, you could leave with a lot of money and without an annoying spouse. Right? So you're carrying a lot of strong economic incentive to get out of the marriage, and you get out with a lot of money. Now, thankfully, most people don't think economically only, but there should be a lot fewer marriages in the early 30s than there are right now. Right? And thankfully, people don't just think materially, but many do. And there's many marriages where this is sort of the source of the end. Practically, be clear on who owns what beforehand. So if both parties own it, if it's feasible to legally have that in writing, then do so. It's good to have. One should have. That's why I advocate unequivocally that any Muslim couple should have a clear marriage agreement. And one of the key things that should be specified in it is how is wealth, and particularly the main property, distributed amongst them. Are they saying, because you can specify that no, anything that legally belongs to me is mine and not my spouse's, the two parties can agree to that in their marriage. Or you can or be explicit that no, we agree to common property law. that we're going to uphold that. Or you can make some combination thereof that will apply, that will apply it to the home, to the home and certain things. And if the two parties agree, Islamically too, that is completely fine. But to be stuck in the middle, right? And people become Sharia experts when it comes to their own interests. The number of times one sister did a 2.5-page argument why we should consider custom and the law of the land in order to accept common property law. Sister, are you an Islamic, like an Islamic law specialist? I've never studied fiqh in my life. But when people, in difficult situations, everyone becomes a lawyer, right? Because they're trying, what can I do to secure my rights? So this is something that if you don't resolve it before death, you're going to put yourself and your inheritors up for very contentious circumstances, right? And it gets messy, and sometimes within our own community, things like that go to court because they want to kick the mother out of the house, or at least it breaks up the family, causes major resentment, etc. So, and whichever way it's set, whether it belongs to one spouse, then if that spouse dies, then the house is divided accordingly. If it was owned 50-50 between husband and wife, then it's a little bit easier because the inheritance only relates to the deceased spouse's 50%. But they have 50% share themselves of the house, plus they have their share of the inheritance. So they're majority owner of the house, so they can't really be forced out of it anyways. But this is something also to include in the will, that in the event of the death, if the will is for the death, the event of death, want to clarify, because if it was owned 50-50, for example, to request from the inheritors to respect the right of the other, of the remaining spouse to live in that house, right? So even if they get that house now, ownership-wise is split among, to ask them to agree for it to remain under the usage of that spouse until that spouse's eventual death. Some families discuss more thoroughly that in the event of death, they agree to move to a smaller house and to sell off that property. But that can be very difficult because there's a lot of emotional attachments to homes, right? So they can agree for it to remain in the ownership of the remaining spouse if the inheritors agree, or they can agree to split the ownership and to agree for them to remain in it. Otherwise, it gets messy because legally, if it purely belongs, so Auntie Jamila made it very clear: this house belongs to me and no one but me. And then Auntie Jamila dies. Now Uncle Jamil, old elderly man, has the only share they have of the house is their inheritance component. Children say, no, we want it sold. They could force that, Islamically and legally. But these are difficult conversations within family, especially as one gets older, family members, etc. But sometimes it's not easy in some cultures to discuss that with parents, but at least the inheritors should discuss that, like the siblings, for example, that if our parents die, what are we going to do in terms of the home? Right? That's not an easy conversation, but those are conversations that concerned Muslims should have, so that we don't create dispute. Because even if you're not able to come to a final agreement on it, but if you've at least started the conversation on the topic, then sometimes it can be a bit easier when the issue comes up. So the family home situation is not an easy.
Yeah. So what about if there's a mortgage on the house and there's some liability?
Yeah. So So that becomes an extra complicating factor, right? Which is why it's important if there is significant, like especially on the home, because some things are easy to sell. You like the car, but it's easy to get rid of it, and the car's cost does not compare to home.
Yeah.
With the home, especially when there's financing involved, etc., and people get themselves in all kinds of messes. They say, well, the mother says, I will keep the house, but you are my children, you must pay the financing. We didn't buy into it. So it becomes really complicated. So which is why, as a family, these are conversations to have in advance.
Yeah.
And in the estate, it should be. And, don't do your will in secret, right? It's like, especially when we're talking about, typically it's older people who die, but not only, but it's something that they should discuss with their spouse. So it's not, you don't want to spring a surprise. To discuss these things out, that, okay, let's clarify ownership of the home, for example. And to work through the scenarios. Right? If there's still financing involved, what happens to that? How will it transfer, etc. To handle those things. So then, last thing, how do you make a living will? Right? And this takes less time than most people's taxes. It's not actually that complicated. Right? One is, there are a number of online templates that you can at least start making the will with. Many of them lack a number of the details that we mentioned here. There are now a number of Muslim lawyers in Canada, actually, and it's a good thing because 10 years ago this was quite rare, right? 20 years ago it was not even imaginable, but now a whole number of Muslim lawyers offer these services, and there's a number of online, if you look Canadian Muslim Will, there's a number of services, a number of which have been endorsed by different scholars and community leaders, and the fees are actually very reasonable. You can at least take that as a basis, and you can customize to your needs. Doesn't take very long. They do a lot of the work for you, right? And that's safer than a good online service is better than an online template, just because usually the better services, one of the things to check is that are they scholars who recognized scholars who approved it? And if you snoop around online, it's not hard, Google Canadian Muslim Will, a bunch of things come. Has it been approved by scholars? Number two, do they engage any lawyers in the process? And several of the services do. I was intending to list a couple of these, but it's not easy to find. Do your research on it. So especially if you do it on your own, consult a lawyer about legal soundness, particularly in case where there's considerations of, large amounts and so on, just as we would do on anything else. Now, for a living will, keep it updated. Right? Keep it updated. Right? Just as we set appointments for work, etc., it's a good habit to use some of the productivity skills that we apply to work to our religious duties too. And one of them, how often you update it, it depends on, there's some people, I have friends whose wealth jumps up and down much more than the stock market, right? Because they're entrepreneurs and they make crazy investments. They go broke one month and then they're living at large 2 months later. So but keep it updated. Practically, if you make it once, then updating it quarterly, updating it 3 times a year or 4 times a year, right? Because not major things change. Or if there's some significant change. Suddenly, you've borrowed $100,000. Just put that into your will. You've decided, the car that you're driving belongs to someone that you didn't want to tell anybody whose car you're driving, or whatever situation. If there's significant details, put them in that. If there's changes in your marital circumstance, you used to be single, now you got married. A day after updating your will, that's significant to your will. Just keep it updated on a need basis, and then share it in some way with the executor of the will, right? And at least let immediate family know where it is. Right? On your computer, you keep a hard copy with your documents. Some people, what they do, they use, they keep it on an online service, whatever online service, and they share it with the executor and with another trusted party, whatever, so people know where it is. Now, there's many other things that would be included here, that can go into living wills that we haven't mentioned. Amongst them is to shut down your social media accounts, okay? Which is why, like, for executors, so I have a friend, his wife died just a couple years ago, and he can't get Facebook to shut down her account. And every year, he gets, like, on his anniversary, he sends me a message. So I got an anniversary message again. I say, you can turn off notifications for that? Because he has access to her account, but he can't shut it down. Now, partly because he's lazy, because I'm sure you could shut it down if you could prove that she's dead. That's pretty straightforward to prove. But, those things, there's mechanisms for things like that. And especially if you have a big online presence or you've got online businesses or whatever, there's ways that, that's where the executor, you could include other things that are important considerations for you that you could take care of. So those are, there's a lot of other secondary details. We'll try to just keep it to what was practically important and needed. We have a little bit of time if there's any questions that people have.
Sure. For a will to be valid legally within Canada, is it not important to get it, for example, notarized or attested by lawyers, or is it just enough to make it myself, share it with my executor? Because, at the time of someone's death, somebody could, what's the proof that somebody who rises up as an executor, what does he have to, doesn't he have to prove that he is a valid executor?
Yes.
So what would he produce to prove that?
No, so that's a bit of a fuzzy zone in that there's an ideally, a will would be a legally verified document, but a large percentage of people don't leave legally robust wills. So it's one of those sensitive areas in law where anything that can be demonstrably shown to be a current enough will is likely to be accepted. Right? It's not ideal, but it's likely to be accepted. Now, so that's what they're, even if you look at, there's a number of even official guides on how to create a will and so on. It's not a requirement that it be notarized, etc. But to the extent that one gets sign off from a lawyer, at least the initial copy, so one can make a copy that has the sign off, etc., that has been notarized, etc., and then you put updates to it that are, that are current. That just makes it less contestable. That makes it less contestable. But overall, unless it's anything really shady, wills are. And then they have, in court, like, there's cases where, for example, people try to change the date of a PDF. But these things, it's not that simple. Because actually someone tried to pull that off with me. So it's hard to change the date of, And one of the practical things, if you make a living will, it's much better to put it in a secure document format, like PDF, for example, than something like just a regular document.
Yeah.
But most of these, they leave a very strong forensic trail within them anyways. Like, you have to be, and may Allah not make you so smart that you take the rights of others, but it's not so easy to pull up, right?
Yeah. So technologically, it would be kind of difficult to keep it updated if you're going the proper legalized and notarized way. So I know you do it annually, as you've mentioned here.
No, but there's certain things you can sign it digital, like you put it in PDF, you sign it digitally, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not, but the ideal case is if one could set up a living will service that's done in a manner that people are comfortably able to keep their wills updated and it's verifiable, That'd be awesome. You're
And
not,
the executors have access to their accounts and they can log in. Yeah, something to do for the community. Good project. Sheikh, another question.
okay, we'll just,
No,
Okay.
let him go ahead with that.
No, bad anyway. So, the second was if someone from us gets appointed as an executor, what would be the responsibilities of an executor? Because I feel that discussing all of this, it's good to go through a will as an executor to get an idea of what all challenges it entails to execute a will.
yeah, no, so that's why, one of the things, if someone gets appointed as an executor, it's a good idea to go to someone within the community who has experience in it, to sort of have them just take one step by step through it. Right? Because many of these things seem really onerous, and this is in general in life, one of the things to do is embrace consulting others. Right? Because unless something looks really difficult, there's people who do it all the time, right? And you can solve a problem relatively quickly, right? And it's just a good idea to once appointed to this, to go to someone to say, look, how do I go step by step through this?
Yeah.
And they could.
Is there anything legal involved in being an executor? Because last year I tried completing my will, and I consulted a couple of friends and asked them if they would be the executors, and they said no. I don't know if there's something legal involved in this. I'm not sure I've ever been one, so I couldn't at the end of the day put anyone as my executor in my will, and I just it's been on the back burner ever since. So are there some legal aspects involved in somebody, trying to accept that responsibility, or is it something which anybody can do it?
I mean, in the good case, right,
Yeah.
which is the inheritors are fine with things, then it's much simpler. Practically, if someone's executing and they're not a lawyer, to consult a lawyer to help drive the process, right? And that's
So it's good to have somebody who's a lawyer be your executor?
not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Could be anybody in your
They
family.
also charge money out.
Yeah.
It's much safer to have someone with experience discharge the will, but then they can consult a lawyer in terms of the broad outline, right? Of what to
Okay.
what to look out for, what to be careful about, but even to safeguard themselves that what is something that is shady or questionable or and in situations also just be careful, right? Like, for example, if all the inheritors are in Canada, except turns out there's a secret second wife in Morocco, and the way it's worded, etc., right? There's going to be a lot of drama involved, etc. It'd be smart to consider before accepting something like that,
Yeah.
right? And number two, before executing, you're not bound to execute it. Just get proper legal consultation on how to execute it. Because sometimes, like in that case, legally, the person could give their will to whoever they want. So the secret, and of course, secret marriage is haram. So I'm not in any way condoning it. But legally, the fact that some of the money is going to the 3 individuals in Morocco, the courts are not at all concerned about that, right? But especially if they're friends or family, you may not want to be the person who sent some of Uncle Jamil's wealth to a secret family that he had in rural Morocco or wherever.
Other than not doing that.
Right? So those kind of situations, so it's a trust. Assisting someone in fulfilling their responsibility has great reward in it, right? But we have a balance, right? Don't put yourself in harm.
I have a question that I'm asking on behalf of the sister.
Mhm.
She's wondering that if her daughter is currently working and wants to buy a condo in the future, she currently lives with her mother right now. Can she do that in terms of the interest that's involved with the payments, etc.?
Okay, so we'll come to that in a second, but is there any question related to a living will first?
If your spouse doesn't want to do the willing and then you cannot do it by yourself for your children. If you have a house, for example, you own the house, and he doesn't want to do the will at all.
So who owns the house?
Both husband and wife.
No, so if the house is jointly owned, then the 50% that belongs to her, that enters into her will. Right? That enters into her will.
She can do for her child by herself.
Yeah, because if the house is jointly owned, then the 50% that belongs to her, that would rightly be, and we can only do the best we can, right? That this is how I want my will estate to be handled. That if and that's where having a sound will and so on, and having an executor that could enforce the will is important. And in a case like that, it's probably not the right idea. It's a case of when the spouse is not necessarily the ideal person to execute the will, right? Usually because of the issue of the house. Any other questions?
Just one question, Shaykh, that let's assume for a minute, in a worst case scenario, both the parents, they die in an accident and they did not write any will, and the kids, let's say 3-4 kids, are all minors. What happens to them if they're living here in Canada?
So that's a legal question, right? So there is, so overall there there is, I put it in my notes, but the governing principle is that they try to act in a manner that takes care of the interests of the children, etc. But failing to have a will has major tax implications, and also to have someone who sort of losing a lot of the estate through all this, through the taxation and the costs of that, because then the court gets involved in ensuring that they're provided for, etc. So that's where, to the extent that one can have a will, it safeguards the children's interests. Also, it gives one discretion on who will have guardianship over them. Because sometimes the choices that are made are not the choices you would have made, right? If you would have had the choice. Because sometimes, for example, they'll say, well, the person has surviving parents, but because they're much older, or maybe they have limited financial means, they may or may not give. It really depends on the discretion of the judge and so on, who gets the children, okay? Who gets primary guardianship of the children, etc., or who can just afford better lawyers. So that's why it's better to take care of it. The other question I'll just deal with separately, just because it's a bit sensitive. We'll stop there. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to facilitate for us to have a sense of urgency in taking care of our responsibilities, and to fulfill those responsibilities with gratitude, looking at the opportunity of preserving the interests of our families, and of the opportunity of doing good for them, and doing wider good through what Allah has blessed us with of wealth. Sallallahu ala sayyidina wa nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.